Morning, Rachel.
Good morning, Richard.
So here we are in beautiful Yamnuska in the eastern end of the Canadian Rockies, and this morning we're going to do a sunrise photo shoot.
Great.
So I've already set the camera up a little bit, but I want to talk about what I've done so far, and then we'll go ahead and take some pictures.
Okay.
Now, when I set up my tripod, I always make sure that we have the V set up like this so that you've got a gap between the rear two legs. Otherwise, it's just a lot more difficult if you've got the camera here and you've got the leg down between your legs. There's more chance of you knocking it, and it just becomes a bit more of a pain.
Okay.
So this is a very basic thing where it's just more comfortable and you can get closer to the camera by setting it up with this leg forward. So now we're all set up, Rachel. We can see the lights now hitting Yamnuska. So let's take some pictures. So why don't you just finish off with the composition?
Okay. This looks good.
Great, and if you're happy with that, then we'll use the remote release this morning if you want to
Okay.
take a picture.
Alright.
So that's looking good, but you can see that the mountain's pretty bright compared to the dark snow, and we want to have the snow to be a bit brighter. Okay. This is a common problem at sunrise or sunset, where we have a big difference between our lit up mountains and our foreground, which is still in the shade. So one way to get over that is to use the neutral density filter that we looked at yesterday.
Okay.
Well, this time we're going to use one that's slightly different. You can see that yesterday we had a filter that was completely solid, and now today's filter it's dark at the top and it's transparent at the bottom. So we put the dark part where the sun is striking the mountain, and the transparent part gives us a longer exposure for the foreground.
Okay.
And we're going to use the same filter holder that we used yesterday as well. So to do this, just put the filter on and then push this down from the top. So what I want you to do is just look through the viewfinder and slowly push this down until you see the dark area get to the bottom of the sun, and then just stop. Okay, and then let's take another shot now.
Okay.
So you can see now, if we compare this photograph that you've just taken to the previous one, that the foreground is a lot brighter.
Yeah.
But it's still not overexposed. So it's allowing us to get a much brighter exposure in the foreground than it is in the background.
Okay.
Now sometimes I would use a polarizing filter in conjunction with a graduated neutral density filter.
And what does that do?
So that would solve any problems that we have with glare. If you're here in the summer or in the fall, then this lake is obviously thawed out and we have a very bright reflection. And the neutral density filter isn't going to help us there. So to calm the bright reflection, then the polarizing filter will do a really good job of solving that problem for us.
Okay.
But today we don't have any water and there's no need to use the polarizing filter. So let's get another photograph. Let's try another shot whilst we've got this great light. Now it's very important with landscape photography. We can see that we've got a good histogram, we've got a nice composition, but what a lot of people forget to do is to check the focusing. So yes, we've got great light, but it's really important now that we double check the focusing.
Okay.
And to do that, we're just going to zoom in on the back of the camera onto the image. So we're going to go right in on the... So you can see that this is really sharp. So that's great. We've got good exposure, nice composition, and the photograph is sharp.
Okay.
Now zooming in is checking for two things, but the focusing, and we're making sure that our long exposure, there's no camera shake during it. As you can see, this is really sharp, so that's great. So the thing to do now is not rest on our laurels, but to move around and take another composition.
Great. Why are you using the remote, Richard?
So the remote is used on these long exposures so that we don't disturb the camera. Even though this is a very solid tripod, you can still, as you press the shutter release, give the camera a slight bit of motion, and then that's going to affect the sharpness in the exposure. So using a remote release is important, either a wired one like this or an infrared one, which is also popular. And if your camera's got a mirror up mode, then that's also important. So if I switch to mirror up, you'll hear what it does. What mirror up allows you to do is when you first press the button, then the mirror's gone up now, and then when we press it again, there'll be no vibration because the mirror's already moved out of place. So that's the actual exposure.
Okay.
So it's
good.
2 presses to take the picture.
Okay.
Now, one thing that's important when we're doing this, especially as the sun is rising behind us, is to make sure that we stand behind the camera. And this is a common problem if you're using a remote release. The tendency is to focus on the landscape and then step off to one side
Right.
and take a picture.
Yeah.
And that's a problem because as the sun comes up behind you, the light of the sun comes in the back of the viewfinder and it goes down to the light meter and it gives you a completely wrong exposure. And you start wondering, why on earth is my exposure wrong? And you look through the viewfinder and you take a picture and it's great. And then you step to one side again and it goes haywire. So that's because the light's coming in the back.
That's
So
so
why
interesting. Yeah.
some cameras like mine have a blind which stops the light from coming in, or you could just stand behind the camera still.
Okay.
So any one of those, but you'll find that as the sun comes up, it's really going to fill the exposure.
Okay. Good to know. Richard, you've been talking about greater f-stop numbers and depth of field relation, and I'm changing my aperture and I just can't see it.
Okay, that's a good point. The reason for that, Rachel, is that when you put a lens on a camera, no matter what f-stop is selected, the camera wants to have the lens fully open, or he wants to see through the lens at the widest aperture. The reason for that is that the autofocus and you to compose need as much light as possible. If you had f16 selected and it automatically put it to f16, there would be so little light coming through that you wouldn't be able to see in the viewfinder to focus. So it actually automatically puts it onto the widest aperture no matter what the aperture's set to.
Oh, okay.
So if you want to see the depth of field, there's a button on the camera called Depth of Field Preview, and that allows you to see the depth of field as you've got it selected on the camera. So Rachel, on this camera, the button is on this side, and if I press it, you can hear the aperture change. Now, if you look through the viewfinder, you should see it's a lot darker,
Yeah.
but you get a much greater depth of field.
Yeah, I see that.
So that only works when you've got a lot of light, because if you've got a very small aperture chosen and you press the depth of field preview button, sometimes there's so little light coming through that you can't actually see the change of depth of field.
Okay.
But if it is bright, then it's a very useful button to press to actually see what's happening with the depth of field.
Great.
So Rachel, I want to talk a bit more about these graduated neutral density filters. I've got 2 examples here.
Okay.
As you can see, one of them is quite a lot darker than the other one.
Mm-hmm.
So these filters come in different values of darkness, so in terms of f-stops usually. So you could get like a 2-stop filter, 3-stop, 4-stop. So the higher the number, the darker the filter is going to be. So usually for landscape photography, you want something around 2 to 4 f-stops. And you choose one depending on how bright the highlights are in comparison to the darkness.
Okay. So how do you know which one to use?
So it really depends on how bright the highlights are, so in this case the mountain, compared to the foreground. So with a bit of experience you can kind of just look at it and guess which filter to use.
Okay.
With film, what we did was we got spot meters and we measured the difference of the highlights to the foreground, but nowadays with a histogram you can actually see what's happening on the histogram. If you've gone and picked a filter that's too dark, the histogram becomes too compressed and too narrow. If you've got one that's not dark enough, then you have spikes on the right hand side in the highlights and usually a spike close to the shadows on the left. So you want to try and find a middle ground where you've got a nice broad histogram and that's the right filter. So it's best to have a range with you. So I usually carry a range of 2 to 4 f-stops of graduated filters.
So what would you recommend for today?
So for today, I would recommend using a 3-stop filter is what we should start off with.
Okay.
Now when you're using these filters, as I showed you earlier on, you just simply look through the viewfinder and you push the filter down until the lowest part of the highlights just gets covered up. One interesting thing is that, as we discussed earlier with depth of field, when you look through the lens and look through the viewfinder, you don't actually see the lens at the aperture you've selected. Now with a filter, that's going to affect the positioning of the filter, because when you actually stop down and take the photograph at the selected aperture, the effective position of the filter is going to change.
Okay.
So what I do is, as I'm pushing the filter down, I actually press the depth of field preview button to make sure that the filter is in the right place. So a combination of looking through the viewfinder, slowly pushing the filter down with the depth of field preview button pressed is going to position the filter very accurately.
Okay.
Now on some filters, like the two-stop filters, then it can be quite hard to work out where the filter actually is. So if you've got a two-stop filter, Rachel, then what I recommend doing is when the filter's in position, you can rock it from side to side,
Right.
and you'll see at the edge of the frame it's getting lighter and darker, and that's a good indication as to where the filter is positioned. Okay?
Okay. It's not working, Richard.
This is a common problem in landscape photography, and that is we've switched our autofocus to the AFS mode, and that means that the priority is the focusing, and the camera will not let you release the shutter if it does not focus on anything.
Okay.
So if it's not focused on anything, then you're pressing the button and nothing's happening, and that's the same on Canon's one-shot autofocus mode as well. The cause is probably because one of the autofocus area sensors is on an area that's either very dark or maybe it's on the blue sky.
Okay.
So we just need to move that to our subject matter. So if you look through the viewfinder again, and then now using the rear dial on the camera, so this control here, move the focus point down so that it's actually on the mountain, then you should find the autofocus is working.
Okay. Ah.
Is that working now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, another thing with focusing on landscapes is to use the live view mode if your camera's got live view. Now, when digital SLRs first came out with live view, I thought, what on earth do I want to use live view for? But I have to admit, it's very useful for focusing because you can zoom right in on a particular part of the scene and very accurately manually focus the lens, and then you can just leave it alone.
Okay.
So let me show you how to do that. First of all, I'm going to put my camera to the live view release mode,
Okay.
and then just press the shutter release button. And now you can see the image on the back of the camera. Now the trick here is to zoom in on the part of the scene that we want to have in sharp focus. So I want the cliff to be in sharp focus. I'm going to zoom in, and this will change from one camera to another camera. So here we are, so we can zoom right in, and now we put the lens to manual focus, and we just zoom. I can just focus the lens now until it's really sharp. So we're almost guaranteed incredibly accurate focusing.
That's great.
One of the problems of autofocus is that when you buy a lens, it's not really accurately tuned to the autofocus of your camera. It's very close, but it's not perfectly accurate, just because of the manufacturing tolerances. So being able to use live view and manual focus actually gives you an incredibly sharp picture. And once you've done that, then because we've turned the autofocus off on the lens, we can just take pictures knowing that each shot is going to be in sharp focus.
Excellent.
And remember that when you do landscape photography or any type of photography, it's really important to check the focusing, because as you look at the back of the camera, this LCD has an amazing 1 million pixels on the LCD, but this is a 24 megapixel camera.
Yeah.
So for every pixel that we see here, there's 23 that we don't see. So you really can't get a good appreciation of sharpness until you zoom right in on the camera back.
Okay. So Richard, I've noticed you do a lot of panoramic photography.
Yeah.
I'd love to create that with my camera as well. Could you give me some ideas on how?
Yeah, sure. And today's a good day for it because we've got nice even light across our viewpoint.
Okay.
So the first thing to do is, on a day like today, we can hand hold the camera, which makes the whole panoramic thing a lot easier.
Okay.
And when you're doing a panorama, you want to rotate your body at the hips and try and keep your feet really still. So the idea would be that you'd bring the camera up to your eye and then just rotate at the hips like that. So first of all, I do that once to make sure that I've got the camera at the right height. You don't want to be doing this as a sequence of photographs and then halfway through realise you're going to have to shift the camera up to get the next mountain in. So kind of practice the movement first, and then you're ready. When you're taking the photographs, then in each frame, look for something about a third of the way in from the right hand side that you can use as an indication as to where to pan to the next time. So if I start off over here, I'm looking in the viewfinder, and that mountain peak over there is about a third of the way in from the right hand side. So that's going to be my reference. So I'll have that on the right hand side now. I'll pan the camera, and then I'll pan the camera until it's on the left side of the next frame. So you always want to have some indication as to for your overlap.
Okay.
Now for the exposure, on a day like today, I would recommend using manual mode. This is one of the few times that manual mode is really useful. And the reason for that is if you're in shutter priority, aperture priority or program, the exposure may change as you are swinging around.
Right.
And that can cause a problem with the stitching because you suddenly might have one picture that's a bit darker. If you're doing a panorama at sunrise or sunset, then you can't really use the manual mode method, because if the sun's coming up on one side of the frame and you're pointing more or less towards it, then it's going to be a very different exposure. So that's a different technique. But on a day like today, when we have a very even exposure across our panorama, then the manual mode's the way to work.
Okay.
So with manual mode, you have to remember to move the aperture and the shutter speed so that the indicator indicates a zero exposure. And then I do that on usually the middle part of the panorama. So I'm going to bring the camera up, and then I'm going to adjust the aperture and the shutter speed. And you can see from the histogram we've got a nice exposure.
Right.
So just try that now with the exposure set.
Okay.
Have one sweep around first of all to make sure you're in the right position.
Okay.
And then take a series of photographs. Okay, great. So what you do now is once you downloaded the photographs, there's lots of different software packages that will allow you to select those photographs in the sequence and then stitch them together.
Neat.
Okay.